Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the World Affairs Councils of America's Cover to Cover session for February. I'm Bill Clifford, President and CEO of WACA in Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to invite all of you from around the country to this conversation over the next hour with Professor Kathryn Stoner of Stanford University, whose new book is Russia Resurrected, Its Power and Purpose in a Global Order. I'm wanting to refer you also to the WACA website, and you've been there before, but there are a number of events that are coming up next week that I'm going to mention at the end of this hour. And also, just to remind everybody, since we are oversubscribed today, hundreds of you are joining us on this Zoom and can present your questions through the Q&A box. And for those of you in the overflow at the YouTube channel, you can also write questions to us via the chat box, and they will be handed over to me through my colleague Laura Duncan so that we can engage you with Dr. Stoner, who I will introduce now. Kathryn Stoner is the Deputy Director at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University and a Senior Fellow at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law and the Center on International Security and Cooperation at FSI. She teaches in the Department of Political Science at Stanford and in the program on international relations, as well as the Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy program. Prior to coming to Stanford in 2004, she was on the faculty at Princeton University for 9 years. She's also taught at Columbia University and McGill University in Canada, of which she's a native of Canada. In addition to many articles and book chapters on contemporary Russia, she is the author of or co-author of 6 books, including the one we'll discuss today, which just came out this month, Russia Resurrected. Kathryn, it's wonderful to have you here for Cover to Cover, and a very timely topic indeed, given the arrival of the Biden administration. You begin the book with a quote from Vladimir Putin, Russia's president. Russia was never so strong as it wants to be, or even how it would like to be viewed, and never so weak as it is thought to be. And many US administrations and the general public here have underestimated Russia or misperceived it as a global power. Tell us, does the Biden administration have a better handle? Can we expect a more granular or more accurate assessment of Russia's power and what it wants to do around the world?
So thank you very much for having me first. And right, that is a quote from Vladimir Putin from about 20 years ago, a little less than, and he's paraphrasing Churchill, who's paraphrasing a bunch of other people. It is really about this paradox of the perceptions of Russian power. This has also been kind of demonstrated by former Senator McCain calling Russia, a gas station masquerading as a country, President Obama saying that Russia is just a regional power threatening some of its neighbors, but not out of strength, out of weakness. So, on the other hand, what we have seen, in particular since Mr. Putin's return to the presidency in 2012, is an increasingly assertive Russia globally. So the seizure of the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine and the continuance of this low-boil civil war that Russia supports on Ukraine's border with Russia, the quick and really effective mobilization of Russian forces into Syria that have fundamentally changed the facts on the ground in the Middle East and really removed the United States from having any influence on how that Syrian conflict is settled. And then, of course, the election interference in 2016, interference in the Brexit referendum in Britain, financing far-right politicians in Europe, buzzing US warships with Russian planes. This continues. The promotion of right-wing populism in Eastern Europe and beyond. And then finally, in 2020, the FireEye cyber intrusion into several major departments within the United States government, as well as some big companies within the United States. So Russia has been very disruptive, yet by these traditional sort of measures that McCain and Obama look at, which is the size of its economy, the size of its population, it doesn't look that powerful on paper. But it's turned out to be very, disruptive. And so the question is why? And we do have different perceptions of Russian weakness or strength. The Supreme Commander of NATO in 2015, Philip Breedlove, noted that Russia's trying to rewrite the Cold War settlement with force. And even new President Biden has said that the biggest threat to America right now in terms of breaking up our security and our alliances is Russia. So is Russia strong or weak? And again, if you look at comparative measures of Russia versus China, Russia has about 146 billion people. China has over a million people, sorry. China has over a billion. We have, 350 million here in the United States. It doesn't look like, that big. It spends about a tenth of what we spend on the military. Its demography doesn't look that good long run. Yet it's tremendously disruptive. And so I do think, from the quote that I just, to answer your question, from the quote I just gave you from President Biden, I do think that he has sort of a better handle on the regime that leads Russia now under Vladimir Putin than the previous president did, and is likely to have a bit more of an appreciation of Russian capabilities. And the question is how to prevent further disruption that comes from Russia, and that's a hard nut to crack.
No doubt the Biden administration will have to find ways to both cooperate and constrain.
Right.
I know we'll come back to this, but I think it'll be helpful for the setting the course of the conversation to talk about really just how far Russia has come since the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991. So nearly 30 years ago. Could you trace for us the revival, which I think Putin would say is quite impressive against the backdrop of Russia's own history, or against any country's rise from a former communist regime, weak democracy, to now your assessment of the autocratic Russia.
Right, what it is, right? Right. So there's a quotation at the very, very beginning of the book that says we have accomplished in 30 years what it has taken other countries centuries, and that is again a quote from Putin. And what he's saying essentially is, we have come back from the devastating collapse of the Soviet Union to being, a modern country that can host the Sochi Olympics. Remember those back in 2014, and the World Cup soccer football, which they did just 2 years ago. And considering the starting point, this is where I think, again, one of the things the book does is try to present different ways of conceptualizing power and reminding us that power is relative, right? And there is a trajectory to development. So in 1991, December 25th, the Soviet Union collapses, and Boris Yeltsin takes over the successor state Russia from Mikhail Gorbachev, who's still alive, by the way. They are in a state of complete economic collapse, partly from Gorbachev's sort of stop-start reforms, but also from 70 plus years of communism, which creates all kinds of inefficiencies. And this is what Yeltsin has to start with in 1992. Some economists have described it as the worst man-made depression outside of war. I think Venezuela may have now surpassed that. When they went into a period of economic reform that caused brief hyperinflation, and they had to privatize their economy. All of this caused huge social dislocation. So a triple transition through the 1990s, which was just a mess, really, for Russia. And yes, right. So trying to do things like privatize property without actually establishing property rights, and still establishing. Sorry, you can probably hear my dog here in the background. I apologize for that.
Okay.
Still establishing a political system, right? And new with an electoral political system. And so by 1999, when Boris Yeltsin leaves office sooner than he had to, his term wasn't over. He comes on television December 31st, 1999, and it's somewhat surprising to Russian people. And he says, "I'm leaving," and the prime minister, who had only been prime minister for about 4 months at the time, Vladimir Putin, is my preferred successor, and so I've asked him to take care of Russia. And with that, Yeltsin leaves the stage. And so Putin comes in, no one knows him. He is inheriting an economy that is starting to grow slightly, but there is also a big turnaround by 2003 in the Russian economy, largely on the backs of high oil prices. And so by 2008, people are seeing huge improvements in day-to-day income and lifestyle. And Russia becomes an upper middle income country. So it has come a long way back. It looks, in terms of GDP, more like Canada than total GDP, and more like a Spain or a Portugal in terms of GDP per capita. That's a very long way to have come in a pretty short period of time. I don't think Putin's quote that I mentioned to you at the beginning is quite accurate, but
more accurate maybe now.
Right, and I've only mentioned the economy. I could also talk a little bit more about military reform too. But
You are muted now.
Sorry, I was just going to say, but I'm going to let my dog out of the room so that we don't all have to enjoy her.
So far, so good.
Okay.
We like pets. Looking back at the Russian reset of the Obama years, I think it's easy to say that because of where we come and Putin's assertiveness since he came back to power in 2012, that it was perhaps naive or a failure. But there were things that in real time really did put the relationship on a positive trend line that you would think would be the building blocks for a good future for not only bilateral relations, but for the Russian people. And these include, and the world, the New START, Russia's being admitted to the WTO, the World Trade Organization,
in 2012. Yeah.
In 2012, actual, if not collaboration with NATO, a
lot of cooperation
that was meaningful, mm-hmm. and ultimately we knew that Sochi was coming. Those Olympic decisions happened, and so Russia was a member of the G8, made G7 to G8, and we're looking ahead to what is a big signal of soft power. And we remember the boycott of Russia in the Olympics in 1980, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
the Soviet Union, yeah.
I should say the Soviet Union,
mm-hmm.
and these things, I don't think were really naive or a failure. What went wrong?
So I think what happened, there was tremendous progress actually under the reset. And so in the book, I cover that. And there are a lot of quotes from then President Dmitry Medvedev, who had been prime minister under Putin from 2000 to 2008, and then becomes president in this castling maneuver, to use a chess analogy, between Medvedev and Putin. In 2008 to 12, he is president, Medvedev that is, while Putin is prime minister, and then Putin comes back into office in 2012. So I think, and the reset really starts to end shortly after Putin announces that he will come back to the presidency. And he does this at his preferred party's Congress, United Russia. The Russian president, according to the Constitution, is not supposed to be a member of a political party. It's kind of a quirk of how the Constitution was written in the 1990s. And he's surprised because this news is not universally well received by the Russian people. They'd like a say in who's going to be president. After all, there hasn't been an election. He's just announced that he will be a candidate, and Medvedev will go back to being prime minister. But they haven't been elected. So there is a protest in December of 2011 against what people think is a cooked Duma election, parliamentary election. And then that continues through 2012 with hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets in big cities, and in particular in Moscow, with signs up that say, Russia without Putin, Putin's a thief. This is followed by when Putin is reelected, and Russian elections. Often the surprising thing is that they happen, not the outcome. Especially at the presidential level, it's pretty tipped in Putin's favor for a variety of reasons. But those protests continue, and you might remember that this is what Putin blames on Hillary Clinton, and he thinks that this has been. He takes a statement of hers, which pretty much any Secretary of State of the United States would have said, which is, Russia should have free and fair elections. He takes that as her basically creating this crowd. He doesn't think anything comes domestically or indigenously. It must come from outside, this crowd against him. And it's basically, though, from fall 2011, 2012, that Russian foreign policy begins to change, and the reset ends in this period when Putin comes back into office. And I think the big trigger, the argument at least I make in the book, is that he seems to have had enough. With Medvedev takes over in the wake of economic crisis, right, globally in 2008. The Russian economy struggles like everybody else in 2009-10. There is some good macroeconomic policy, and they have a lot of foreign reserves, and they have a sovereign wealth fund, and so they are able to defend the ruble, in the way that they want to. Eventually, they let it float, but they don't have a huge public debt issue, but Medvedev. Cooperated a lot. Putin countenanced that with the West, that is in NATO, even allowing us to send our equipment through Russia into Afghanistan to support our ongoing conflict in the Afghan war during the reset. Having such that in the end, and the New START, as you mentioned, which has just been extended. Agreement limiting the number or capping the number of long-range nuclear weapons each side can have. That's all great. Also passing a visa regime where it's easier for Russians to get visas to come here and work or study, and the same for the United States. All that is gone except for the New START now. It seems to be Libya that sets Putin off. The fact that in the United Nations Security Council, Medvedev instructs the Russian representative to not veto NATO bombardment of Libya under Muammar Gaddafi. And this is apparently very argued among senior elites in the military in Russia. And I think that combined with the concern over the economy and his legacy, Putin decides to come back. And this is where we see the reset end. So it's not that we were naive or that the reset was a failure. It was in many ways a success. It's that Putin decided to end the reset. And I think that's closely coordinated too with domestic politics and some of the protests that I mentioned. And I make that argument in the book.
That tipping point of the UN vote on Libya, so that was seen as an acquiescent Medvedev. Putin doesn't want Russia to appear weak on the international stage.
There's that, and then also, Putin and Medvedev are from a different generation in some ways, right? Medvedev's much younger, and so a little, perhaps, he sees the world in the West in a somewhat different way. I don't want to overstate that, because he is still a creature of Vladimir Putin. He almost hasn't worked for anyone but Vladimir Putin in his life. He had a brief stint when he didn't. So you don't want to overstate that. But I think it's a combination of feeling the, increased incursion. I remember blaming the Hillary Clinton in the United States for protests against him in Russia. And then here is the United States. They've, instigated, according to Putin, the Arab Spring. Now they're bombing Libya, a sort of erstwhile sometime ally. Russia has a lot of contracts for construction and Libyan oil transport in Libya, and there they are killing off Gaddafi. And so I think it's just this increased incursion and the domestic politics interference that he perceives is enough for him.
I want to get to the latter Obama years Trump, which I see as accommodationist, or just not out of the norm of how a president would deal with Russia. But then quickly get to your your original scholarship on the sources of power and how we should view the constituent parts, and things like how agile Putin is and is able to be in the context of his political system, in the context of domestic politics, and what he's willing to do, and how will is married to capability. Right. So you mentioned at the beginning, there is, after Sochi, there is the invasion of Crimea, there is the intervention in Syria, which is remarkable because Russia had not done so outside its sphere of influence, I guess, and then the appalling hacks of not only the DNC but the Republican National Committee. Those were not leaked, but that interference in our election, Obama was restrained. Why? And Trump goes beyond restraint to what I would call accommodation and relinquishing levers of U.S. power, allies.
Right. Supplication even in the Helsinki press conference. Yeah. So in terms of Obama, that may have been an issue. That's more an issue of American politics, I think, in terms of quote unquote being soft. He did say to Putin, at one of their last meetings, "We see you doing this kind of interference. Stop it." But he felt, by his own account, constrained by American politics and Mitch McConnell ultimately not wanting to go public with this. And so he didn't very much before the elections. They certainly did after. And remember, it was the Obama regime, I shouldn't say regime, the Obama administration that originally sanctioned Russia for this. And this is what got Trump's first national security advisor into trouble, right? Saying we're going to take those off when we come in, before he was actually appointed. I think that the Russian administration or regime right now under Putin has been, they were kind of lucky on that there's so much division within the United States and our own political actors, that kind of worked out in their favor. They to some degree. Trump personally, yes, was peculiarly laudatory of Putin himself. And so, it's an enduring question that I don't answer in the book, why that's the case. It could be that he simply likes autocrats, and I think we have some good evidence of that, right? His visits to North Korea, and then his own persistent, claims that the U.S. presidential election that elected Biden is somehow fixed. So he's, he seems to be autocratically sympathetic, let's put it that way. His administration, though, pursued a policy that was somewhat different than what he seemed to articulate publicly and in his rather infamous press conference in Helsinki, and I guess that was 2017 or 2018 with Putin. They continued the sanctions under Trump. They basically kind of gave up on trying to settle the issue of Crimea between Ukraine and Russia, and it is a difficult issue. But they even extended some of the sanctions. But by the end of the Trump administration, we were in a situation that was frozen, basically, with respect to Russia. Trump made a big mistake, I think, in ceding the Middle East, for the most part, to Putin's Russia. Syria, has become a tremendous, not dead weight for Russia. It's actually a success. It's a key part of their oil strategy. They've gained control over the infrastructure of moving oil and natural gas around the Middle East. They are now part of OPEC Plus. We used to say, as we watched global oil prices rise in between 2003 and 2008, that Putin got lucky there, that he didn't control global oil prices. Well, now Russia has more input than it's ever had into global oil prices, and has an uneasy relationship with Saudi Arabia. But if you watch Putin at any meetings of the G20, when they used to meet in person, one of the first people he goes to shake hands with is the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. So they also, Russia's also selling arms to Saudi Arabia. That's supposed to be our ally. Also, has sold a lot of arms to Syria and throughout the Middle East, has good relations with countries that are traditional enemies in the Middle East: Israel and Iran, Iran and Saudi Arabia. In terms of getting around sanctions that we and the Europeans have placed on Russia, there are alternatives for Russia now. The world has changed as Trump kind of did nothing in the last year, nothing new anyway, last year or two of his administration with respect to Russia. And one of the ways it's changed is because he withdrew the few troops that we did have in Syria. Russia has just established Syria as a place to show off its new weapon systems, which it's developed since 2008, and selling those weapon systems, and gradually, including to Egypt, and with Egypt and other countries in the region moving gradually through, Libya. Also selling Venezuelan oil. The reason Maduro is still in power in Venezuela, so moving to Latin America now, is because of Russia. And Russia's basically taken over the Venezuelan national oil company, refines and markets and moves that oil as well. So the world has changed rather considerably, and just looking at GDP as opposed to control of things like transportation and influence in energy markets is a pretty significant leverage point for Russia in the global economy, even if its own GDP is not the biggest in the world. So I think by the traditional measures of power, we're not taking these kinds of things into account. But we can also talk more about traditional and non-traditional means of power too.
I'm going to get that right now, and we're just about at the halfway point. We're talking with Dr. Kathryn Stoner of Stanford University, whose book is Russia Resurrected. And one more from me before we go to the chat boxes, both on the Q&A for our Zoom, and those watching on YouTube live can submit through the chat box. Kathryn, just where we are right now, is Russia a strong or weak global power? Using your grid.
Okay, so what I do is try and present a kind of multi-dimensional perspective on power, and I'll see if I can actually even show you a quick slide on this. But I think of power in, here, I can do this. Let me see if this will work. Host disabled participant screen sharing, so I can't. So I'll
let's
just
see
tell
if
you.
Laura Duncan can, from the
All right.
background, enable you.
If she lets me know, then I will.
Okay.
But essentially, what I do is I point out that the traditional way of thinking about power is looking at the means a country might have. And I think of power as the ability of one state to get another to do something that it might not otherwise do, and that power is relative, right? So I think of three dimensions: means, that is the sort of traditional measures of power of men, military, and money, right? The size of the military, the size of the economy, the size of the population. And I use some work of other political scientists to point out that geographic domain matters in terms of influence countries have, right? So where and how many countries does Russia exercise power over? And then also in what areas, in what policy areas, and how important an actor Russia is in those areas. So in terms of the means of power, the traditional ones, that is men, military, and money, the book does go through, the strengths and weaknesses of the economy, and pointing out, the ups and downs. The Russian economy has been a kind of unsteady basis on which to increase Russian influence globally. But it's not as weak as you might think it is, right? So often we're told it's a mess, and the John McCain quote that I gave you there, that all they do is oil. They do a lot of oil. They're either the number one, depending on the moment, number one or number two oil exporter in the world. They vary this with Saudi Arabia, but they do other things too. And a lot of those things are heavy industry. So those huge tires you might see in the Athabasca oil sands, or big tractors, or they export nuclear energy plants into the developing world, even to places like India, actually. And they're the number two in the world in terms of weapons exporters. We're number one. And they have a lot of other precious metals that make your cell phone work. They're not the only ones who have that, but they've also gone and expanded their geographic domain. So not just a regional power anymore, as Obama called them in 2014. They're really, you can find a Russian imprint almost everywhere. They are very present militarily and economically in the Arctic. Global warming has sort of assisted in this, in their preparation for a northern transport route. China is very interested in that. Mm-hmm. And China and Russia have grown closer, partly because the Chinese economy has such a tremendous demand for energy, and Russia is right there, able to help supply it. President Xi of China and Vladimir Putin have exchanged, the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor, and have referred to one another, as I note in the book, as my very best friend. But Putin has gone ahead and established relationships and been the first Russian president not only to consistently visit places like China, but also India, in through the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned, Israel, using also things like soft power to try and attract societies that are more conservative. The Russian anti-gay movement or gay laws, and sort of criticisms of an overly permissive West resonate in a lot of parts of the world. And so Russia has tried to build up soft power, which I can talk about more, this kind of power of attraction to its values as an alternative pole, with some success, to be honest. And then, of course, sharp power, which is something that we've experienced in terms of hacking, but also using social media to change the information environment around an election, around a referendum, or to exacerbate divisions within societies that might already exist, as we saw some of the activity in 2016. They've done that not just in the United States, they've done that through Europe as well. And so the book goes through these different areas of power that we might not think of if we just look, as evidently John McCain did, at just basically economics, right? Russia's been tremendously disruptive without having to be the richest and having the most people, or even a lot of people, relative to the United States and China. And so that's why by the end of the Trump administration, our own military doctrine identifies Russia and China as the two biggest threats to the United States, but in very different ways. So what's
Russia,
remarkable,
as a disruptive power, that's a choice.
Yes,
Didn't have to be.
right.
So this is from Karen Siegel in Michigan. It goes to whether Russia has a grand strategy and the question of choice. How much is Putin driven by clear objectives, and what are they, versus finding any opportunity to thwart the West?
Yeah, so really interesting. Is this, I'm not, probably can't, oh, I can, here, I'll share my screen right now. Let me see. I have, this is to help answer the question. So is this a Russian grand strategy that is kind of spreading influence in different ways? Or is it a Putinist grand strategy? That is, would any leader of Russia behave the same way, right? So there are arguments that all countries have structural interests, right? Depending on where the country is geographically, where it is, in terms of national security, right? That no one wants to be invaded. You want your people presumably to your society to be stable. So would a different Russian leader behave the same way? And I think that is a really interesting question that I try to answer in the book. And my answer is no. This regime, because it is an increasingly hard autocracy, is frightened about instability at home. And so, sanctions have forced it to look for markets elsewhere, and for leverage over other countries elsewhere. And in part, that's to demonstrate that Putin himself, as the leader of a cronyistic network that steals from the state, is very popular, and that other elites should not challenge him. And it's also to try to stabilize the economy, right? As well as protect national security interests. So one of the counterfactuals I kind of run in the book is think of, as much as Russia has accomplished over the last 30 years in terms of resurrecting, some aspects of Soviet power, but also creating new areas of influence globally. As much as they have accomplished that and resurrected a good part of their military as well, they could have gone so much farther with a different kind of regime. Without this, increasingly greedy set of elites around Vladimir Putin, who steal from the state, and so Putin holds Russia back in some ways. So I think there is a grand strategy in general, but there are some things that are very specific to Putin, and one of them is seeing Russia as under siege from the West. This is really for a domestic audience, because popularity, his own, is a political resource for him at home. It's not inevitable.
This is a great segue to the next question from Frank Rettenberg. Putin's objectives seem related only to the foreign sphere. He seems to express no interest in, say, improving the Russian standard of living. How long can this go on? And does this neglect of the domestic sphere help explain the phenomenon of Alexei Navalny, the opposition figure who has been jailed and who has stirred protests?
Okay, so I would question the premise of the question. So he does not ignore domestic concerns, and in fact, there's a little bit of responsiveness in all autocracies to domestic politics. So there have been demonstrations that, for example, against a pension reform recently that was going to raise the retirement age. So people went out on the streets, and especially older people, to protest against this, and the regime withdrew or extended the time frame, let me put it that way, of implementing that law. So there's some degree of responsiveness. And there's a quote also in the book that Putin says we need evolutionary reform in Russia, not revolutionary. We've overfulfilled the plan, referring to the Soviet system of planning in Russia in terms of revolutions. So why is that? Well, he wants to keep society pacified enough and stable, but not have development go so quickly that he is thrown out of power because people want more. So Russians are living better than they ever have in history right now. Now that doesn't mean they're living as well as they ever could, and I'm a firm believer that with a different government that is not as corrupt, then they would be doing even better. So the hundreds and thousands of people that you've seen out on the streets over Alexei Navalny believe the same thing. Many of those people are, the middle class that have benefited from the improvements in the Russian economy, and they are now, very concerned about corruption and the inequality that has developed. So, our society here in the United States is very unequal. Russia's is almost as unequal in terms of the 1% of the population controlling 60 or 70% of the wealth. It's not a good, we see social unrest here as a result of that. And so we're seeing social unrest there as a result of the same thing. Alexei Navalny has really capitalized on this, pointing out, with a really interesting video. It does take 2.5 hours to watch, but he really makes the whole issue of elite level corruption come alive in Russia with this video that is about this palace that was allegedly built for Putin at the cost of about 1.2 or 1.3 billion dollars. Navalny is not, he's not a politician per se. What he has done super effectively is he has really, this is an issue everybody complains about in Russia, and he has really effectively used social media and social media platforms like YouTube, but also Telegram in Russia and TikTok. And so his little organization really appeals in particular to young people in Russia. And this is a huge problem for Putin's regime stability in the longer term, right? He's been in power now 20 years. And so there is an entire generation of people from 18 to 24 or so who have known no other leader. And they get frustrated when admission to university is not done on an equal or fair or meritocratic basis, but more you didn't get your spot because some rich person's kid did. That happens here too, right? But it happens there on a sort of more extreme scale.
Great. Do you have another slide that you'd like to share to emphasize, or else I'm going to invite you to come back so that we can see you?
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. I always forget to stop share. Yeah.
That's okay. All right.
Sorry about that.
I'd like to move to perhaps a NATO question, because Putin has used NATO as an excuse, really. But a question from Gary Lafort is: does Russia have ambitions in the Baltic states? And if so, how will the EU and NATO respond? And perhaps we can put that at the backdrop. We heard Foreign Minister Lavrov say that Russia's ready to dispense with relations with NATO.
And the EU.
I'm sorry, and the EU.
Yeah, right.
Pardon.
Right, because they don't really have any relations with NATO right now. But yes, with the EU, that's a recent thing. Okay, so I think that's a lot of bluster. But in terms of the Baltics, so Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, I was asked in another talk I did, could Russia just take one of those or all of those countries? So yes, they could. And it would, according to folks in our military, and this is in the book, it would probably take us weeks or months to respond to that, because Germany has one tank. So so it would take a while for us to mobilize, and then some serious decisions would have to be made about what we would use and whether that could go nuclear. So the short answer is yes, they could, right? Would they? No. According to former President of Estonia, Ilves, who was at Stanford for a year or two, he said that's not what he worried about, particularly an invasion, because Russia could be sufficiently disruptive without having to use the military in the Baltics. Mm-hmm. And partly that is a legacy of Soviet era infrastructure, right? So think about Texas right now, which is self-contained and under an extreme weather event, and its electricity grid is down and people are freezing. So Moscow still runs a lot of the electricity grid of former Soviet republics in different aspects, as well as determining their energy supply. So, just grouping them grossly together, the Baltics are trying to remedy that situation, but that's not fast and easy. Russia can also use what we have seen it use also in Ukraine, denial of service attacks for the internet. This is so-called sharp power, right? To poke and prod a country to do what they want it to do, and has done that with the Baltics. So should they want to be more disruptive with the Baltics, that will be the way they go. And they've actually been, somewhat effective in doing that. But I think the Baltic republics have been very good for the most part in terms of establishing strong institutions, democratic institutions there. But yes, if they wanted to, if the Russian leadership decided that they wanted to take back the Baltics, they could, and it would take us a long time to do anything about it. And that also relates to sort of Russia increasing the efficacy of its military, which was, terribly devastated following the collapse of the Soviet Union.
We certainly have more questions than we're going to be able to get to. So I hope we'll have an opportunity to engage you another time. And also, I know that our councils would be willing to host you as well for virtual. And before long, I hope we are able to convene you in person as well. Mm-hmm. I wonder how the January 6th insurrection here was perceived in Russia. And when you talk about power, our military remains strong. Our economy, by many measures, is doing well. There's vast inequality, which isn't good, certainly. But to what extent does an event like that damage, for a lengthy period, U.S. standing, and particularly with respect to Russia, its people and its leaders?
Yeah, so I've been in a few conversations with people from the region, noting that the Russian government, you can watch the international television station Russia Today, RT, which is their coverage of January 6th. They're obviously very pro-Trump, and pushed the line that the elections were corrupt. And in the past, Russia has actually sent election monitors to the United States, especially to Florida, to observe. And they actually had an institute that for modern Russia that also was in the United States at an office in New York City for a couple of years to monitor human rights in the United States. That's now closed down, but that's sort of its soft power. It was exploited, right? That this is, the U.S. is disorderly. There's chaos when people come out on the streets. We can't run elections. That these results are in question. So when we try to say to countries like Russia or China, Especially in most recently in terms of Alexei Navalny, and 10,000 people in Russia have been arrested related to the January 23rd and 30th public demonstrations against corruption and in favor of getting Navalny out of jail. Not necessarily in favor of liberal democracy. When we say things to Putin's regime like observe human rights, that is not taken very seriously. And we can't manage things at home. What kind of example are we, and who are you to tell us? And so that is, unfortunately, that's happening not just in Russia, but elsewhere. So it's done tremendous damage to our standing and influence abroad, and that has to be a huge thing on Biden's agenda, which is why I think he did a CNN town hall a couple of nights ago, and one of the things he said is we're not divided, right? So trying to put that back together, and it's important domestically as well as reputationally in the international arena.
Great. A question from, we'll stay at the great power level, and then we'll delve into soft power, and finally the future of Russia after Putin. This is from Alan Norman. How concerned is Russia about the rise of China, notwithstanding the short-term rapprochement and sales to the People's Republic of China? And could the Cold War script of West and PRC versus USSR shift to West and Russia to temper China's ambitions?
Or a third possibility is Russia and China to temper Western ambitions. And unfortunately, I think that third possibility right now is where we're at. So there is some material in the book, if you're particularly interested in Russia and China, to look at. And as I think I mentioned earlier, Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi personally have expressed, their warm friendship, and Xi has called Putin, a great friend of the Chinese people. So what is all of this about? Well, both are to the United States rogue nations, and Russia's looking for markets for its oil and gas, and China's looking for energy. And sometimes they cooperate and sometimes they compete. Increasingly, they've been cooperating because they, are on the outs with the United States in particular, which is the world's biggest economy. But China is, challenges us for that spot, obviously. So they move differently in the international system. China is really, trying to feed that that local domestic economy, right? So trying to keep people employed, trying to create jobs, to maintain social stability there. It's always cheaper if people you don't have to use force to keep your people off the streets. And at the same time, Russia has to look for new investors because and new markets for its products and raw materials resources because it's under sanction. So in a sense, they are natural partners. Russia does not pursue its foreign policy, unlike the Soviet Union, with an strong ideological influence. There is this kind of illiberalism and conservatism, but that sort of appeals to the, you're preaching to the choir in a sense, in terms of the many countries to which that is appealing, right? In the Middle East, and to some degree in China as well. So they are united in being autocracies. And they have sort of coincident interests at the moment. And unlike the Sino-Soviet split you were referring to in the 60s, there isn't an ideological issue here, and that's what caused the split then. So they do compete in some areas, but increasingly they're cooperating, and it's actually a really interesting area of research. The book talks about where they cooperate in terms of military exercises too. And Russia sells China a lot of military equipment, which creates chains of dependency, right, to keep that equipment working.
Very interesting. This is from Donna Hefner of Jacksonville, Florida, and others have posed a similar question. Could you share a bit about what Russia's response to the coronavirus has been, and in the foreign policy realm, how its use of the Sputnik vaccine is a success or not in soft diplomacy.
Yeah, so they're just starting to get the Sputnik vaccine, Sputnik 5, and that's a reference to, its space program, of course. So they were hit very hard by COVID, and for a while in the spring they had the second highest number of cases per capita. The numbers are a little bit unreliable because the Ministry of Health there counted deaths only if there was no comorbidity. So you had to die of COVID alone to be counted as a COVID death. Those numbers are now being adjusted, but they've gotten it more under control, and for the most part, they're out of hard quarantine and lockdown. Although they did have that for a long time. So Sputnik, it does work. It has now been, independently. It's been reviewed, the data on it independently, and there's a Lancet piece out confirming that it works, and it's over 90% effective. So this is again something I think we underestimate Russia on. They're pretty good at pharmaceuticals, and they don't have a high infant or child mortality rate, partly because they've maintained this vaccination capability that was in the Soviet period. People die young, but later in life, not as kids under 5. What can they do? Yeah, it's a great opportunity. I just read an article by a friend of mine who's a Russian. It's a great opportunity in terms of soft power, right, and vaccine diplomacy. And they're starting to sell it. I know into Latin America, and I would take it. People have it's the problem is that the Russian regime under Putin has lied so many times about other things. Like, remember those little green men who took over Crimea and didn't have the insignia on? Well, at first, the Russian government said, "Oh, those aren't our guys," but of course they were their guys, right? So when they actually, it's like the boy who cried wolf. When you actually come up with something that is legitimately, true, and in this case, the Sputnik 5's efficacy, people doubt it. But yeah. Even their own people, to be honest. But now I think more people are taking it.
Great. I want to get to a few more quickly. Becky Cederholm of Hilton Head asks, who is Putin grooming to take his place? And Linda Fitzharris, also of South Carolina, different place. What is the future of Russia after Putin?
Okay, so really related questions that I can probably handle together. So just this year, over the summer, an amendment was passed. Well, several amendments, many amendments were passed to the Russian Constitution, and Putin was very anxious this time last year to get these passed. And the most important one was extending his presidency potentially until 2036. So currently, his term was to have ended in 2024, and so the succession issue was looming. So why do it so soon was one question, and there is a rumor that he has Parkinson's. That's not been confirmed. If you watch him walk, you'll see he kind of has an awkward walk. Some people, I've spoken to, think it's because he's used to carrying a gun as a former KGB agent. I don't know about that, but anyway, it could be that one leg shorter than the other. But there is this rumor that perhaps he's in ill health, and there was a big rush to have this referendum passed even during the pandemic. And one of the many things it does, and it was a whole package of reforms, so you took the whole thing or not, but one of the many things that it does is provide this possibility of him running for 2 more terms, which for the Russian president are now 6 years each. Yeah. So he could be in power until 2036. So it depends on what your time horizons are. And this will be presumably up to him. He's about 66, 67 now. So, and he's pretty healthy as far as we know, but there is this kind of Parkinson's rumor. So
there's a lot of opportunity to either continue the revival, to disrupt certainly, or to make mistakes.
Right. Right. It's hard to imagine. Right.
Go ahead.
There's no pressure for a successor currently.
Yeah.
Right.
Not really from Navalny just yet.
Oh no.
Coming
Yeah.
back to Washington, D.C., and Susan Eikenberry, and this will be the last question. What should Biden do first with regard to Russia? And of course, he and Putin have had a phone call that covered a range of issues, but what should the Biden administration do first?
Well, so they've done the very, very first thing they should have done, which was extend the New START agreement for another 5 years. And really, they've been criticized a little bit because, you should have held out longer and made some important changes to it. Well, the previous administration left them no time to do that. It was going to expire February 5th. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is there's a lot more to be done on arms control. Russia actually has an advantage over us in terms of short-range nuclear weapons, and Putin has, rattled around those and saying that, I almost used them in the Crimean situation. We have to re-engage with Russia on some issues, and one of those is constraining Iran's ability to produce a nuclear weapon. And so I think we have to drop. There's a whole agenda with Iran. We need Russia now on that more than even we did the first time. But Russia has actually relatively good relations with Iran, and we can agree that neither of us want Iran to go nuclear. Second, we need to speak up a little bit more about transgressions within Russian society, but we also do have to cooperate in certain areas with Russia. And so, another big issue is Ukraine and making Ukraine successful as a democracy on Russia's borders, could encourage people within Russia to see that this can happen here, and, you can demand better. And then a third thing is, given that there is this sort of youth disaffection with Putin's regime, make it easier for young Russians to come to the United States. That's all to our benefit. Think of who started Google, right? Russian emigres. And it is to the disadvantage of the current regime. The only people who can really change the form of governance in Russia are Russians. And that's the biggest threat to Vladimir Putin, not us and not NATO. But we've lost a lot of leverage in the last few years over Russia. And so our sort of evacuation from global responsibilities has also helped to resurrect Russian influence globally.
Thank you very much. We've been talking with Dr. Kathryn Stoner of Stanford University. She teaches political science and international relations. Her new book is Russia Resurrected, Its Power and Purpose in a New Global Order. Kathryn, there are so many great questions that we did not get to, so I would be pleased to facilitate future engagements, virtual or otherwise, at councils around the country. I also want to let our audience know that we have a number of upcoming programs. The next Cover to Cover will be March 3rd, featuring Charles Kupchan, whose book is Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World. We'll also be presenting Ambassador Edmond of Haiti next Tuesday at this hour, 2 to 3 o'clock, to discuss the political developments there, what Haiti's progress as a democracy has been, and where U.S.-Haitian relations are and are going. And then on Thursday, we'll look at the EU's economic reforms and how vaccine diplomacy is happening there and what is happening with Brexit and the EU. So a lot on our agenda. Again, Dr. Stoner, Kathryn, thank you very much for participating in Cover to Cover today.
My pleasure.
Good luck with your book. It's a clear-eyed look at Russia, a complex country. We need to have more of your analysis.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Stay well,
everybody.
everyone.
Yes, be healthy. Good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.